You're 12. Your mother ties the last knot on your gown with trembling fingers. She doesn't speak. She hasn't all morning. The fabric is stiff. It itches where the collar bites into your skin. You're not sure if it's silk or wool, only that it's too heavy for your shoulders. The bells ring. Not for school, not for church, for you. You're not being buried. You're being married. But the silence in the room feels the same. Outside, the men laugh. Drink, trade coins, horses are exchanged, promises made. You don't know what they've agreed on. You weren't asked. You weren't told. You were simply chosen. They say you're lucky. They say it as they place the veil over your face, as if it hides your age, as if it hides the way your eyes still search the corners of the room for your dolls. They say, he's wealthy. They say, you'll be fed. They say, obey him. What they mean is, you no longer belong to yourself. He is a man. You're not a woman. But that doesn't matter. Because today you are a wife. The church is cold. Damp stone, iron gates. You walk down the aisle not as a bride, but as a message, a transaction completed. You hear the priest's voice, but not his words. Something about obedience, something about duty. His hand is bigger than yours. It swallows your fingers. You do not squeeze back. You've seen him before. Once. From across a courtyard. He smelled like pipe smoke and fur. He didn't speak to you. He spoke to your father. Now he lifts your veil. His eyes scan your face the way a farmer inspects a foal. For health. For breeding. You don't cry. You blink. That's all. Because to cry would mean disobedience. To disobey would mean punishment. And punishment comes later. After the feast. They feed you sweet bread, stew, roasted bird, wine. You sip. The flavors blur. Everyone is smiling. You're not hungry, but they watch to make sure you eat. A girl who refuses food might refuse other things. You're paraded like a trophy, lifted into a carriage. You wave, though you don't know why. You try to smile. It feels like theft. The door closes behind you. The road to your husband's house is not long. But you begin to understand the distance you've crossed. You were a child this morning. You're not one now. His home is large, quiet. The servants don't speak to you. They don't look at you. You're led to a bed. Not soft. Not yours. He comes in later. He says nothing. You want to sleep. He does not. The room is dark. The bed creaks. Your body is not ready. He knows this. That is not the point. You learn that your pain is his right. That your silence is expected. That the stain on the sheet will be inspected. You wonder if this is what your mother meant when she said, endure. In the morning your name has changed. Your voice has not. You do not ask questions. You fold linens. You kneel at prayer. You bleed. You scrub. You serve guests with words you don't understand. You do not speak of the night. You do not speak of the ache. You do not speak of what you miss. Your sister's laughter, the crack in the kitchen wall, the way your father used to lift you without hesitation. You were lifted again last night. But it was different. Because now, you are not a girl. You are his. You were never meant to be a person. You were meant to be a gift, a dowry, a treaty sealed in skin. That's what medieval marriage was. Not love, not partnership, not even survival. It was a property exchange, and you were the property. Your father raises a goblet at your betrothal feast, but it's not joy he's celebrating. It's a deal, a transaction, land for blood, peace for obedience, two families tied by a girl who doesn't get to say yes. No one claps for the oxen traded. No one cries for the acres passed down. No one asks the girl how it feels to be the glue between men's hands. She's 13, maybe younger. She's currency with curls. In England, noble daughters were matched by the age of 8. Sometimes earlier. They were promised to boys they would never meet, or to men already old enough to have buried one wife. The richer the girl, the less freedom she had. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married at 15, not because she wanted to, but because her body carried a kingdom. Her hips were fields, her womb was a throne. She brought with her all of Aquitaine, and so she was married like a shipment, signed, escorted, delivered, and she was lucky, because she survived. Others did not. Margaret Beaufort was married at 12, pregnant at 13. She gave birth to the future King Henry VII while still bleeding from a body not fully grown. She never bore another child. Her pelvis was crushed in the process. The man who arranged the marriage gained royal favour. Margaret gained a lifetime of pain. This wasn't cruelty by accident. It was policy. Fathers didn't raise daughters. They prepared them for contracts, for alliances, for sacrifice. Even poor families followed the same logic. A farmer with 5 daughters knew each one was a chance at more land, more livestock, less burden. A girl who could marry at 14 saved the household years of feeding a mouth that earned no coin. So she was sent, with goats, with linens, with silver cutlery if they had it. She was the dowry, but she also carried it. Everything placed in her hands was a reminder. You are worth exactly this much. And once handed over, she became part of someone else's inventory. Husbands didn't marry women. They acquired them. A woman's land became his. Her inheritance became his. Her servants, her letters, even the clothes on her back became subject to his permission. Under the law, she couldn't sell, own, or even give away a gift without his approval. She couldn't leave because she was part of the estate, and estates don't walk. In rare cases, 2 families fought over a bride's value. How many acres she brought, how many cows. If the numbers didn't match, the wedding could be called off even after the vows, because the ceremony meant nothing without the transaction. That's what they don't show in fairy tales. The part where the princess is sold with grain. The part where love is never mentioned. The part where marriage isn't union, it's acquisition. And you don't have a voice. Because voices don't belong on ledgers. It's not just the wedding that's a ritual. It's the night after. The food is cleared, the wine poured out, the musicians lower their flutes. But no one goes home yet. Not until the marriage is proven. Not until the crowd is sure the girl was taken. That's the part no one talks about. Not in poems, not in paintings. But in medieval Europe, the wedding wasn't finished until the marriage was consummated. Until the bride's blood sealed the contract, and people waited for it. Some watched from the hallway. Some stood inside the room. A priest blessed the bed. A noblewoman pulled back the covers. The crowd drank to the couple's health, then waited for the screams, because screams meant it had worked. Some regions required proof of linen, a blood-stained sheet held up by servants and waved from the window. Cheers followed. Toasts. Applause. If there was no stain, there were questions. Was she truly a virgin? Had the marriage failed? Was the bride defective? The fault never lay with the groom, even when he was drunk, even when he was violent, even when the girl was 12, because girls can't fail. They could only refuse, and refusal had consequences. In feudal France, refusal to consummate a marriage was grounds for annulment or punishment. A nobleman could appeal to the church, claim he was denied his marital rights, and have the girl examined. Midwives would inspect her body, declare her sealed or spoiled, and send her back, like a broken object returned for refund. The law backed it. Canon law made it clear. A wife's body belonged to her husband. She had no right to deny him. To refuse was to defy God. It was sin, disobedience, sometimes treason. And if she bled, all the better. Pain meant success. Virginity wasn't just fetishized, it was weaponized. It proved the girl had never been touched by another man, that her family had kept her pure, that her value, like any crop or coin, was still intact. But purity wasn't protection. It was the reason for the violence. In Italy, some towns held bedding ceremonies where the couple was led to the bed by their entire family. They were stripped by attendants, kissed, laid down, the doors shut, and then silence until it was over. In one German court the girl was only 10, the husband 52. He waited 3 nights, not out of mercy, but because the bishop told him the optics were poor. On the 4th night he proceeded. The next morning the chambermaid wept while changing the sheets. No one else blinked, because that's how things were. Marriage made it legal. It made anything legal, even the injuries, even the silence, especially the silence. Wives didn't report what happened that night, because there was no one to report it to, because no one would call it violence. It was a duty, a ritual, a tax the body paid for being born female, and the younger the bride, the more likely she bled, the more likely the sheet held proof, the more likely the family rejoiced, even if she couldn't walk the next day, even if she never smiled again. The girl had done her part, and now she was a woman. Marriage wasn't just a bond, it was a sentence. Once the vows were spoken, once the priest lowered his hand and the husband raised his, the law changed. Not for him, for her. Because a wife was no longer a full person, she was a legal extension of her husband. Under medieval English law, this was called coverture. A woman's legal identity disappeared beneath her husband's. She could no longer own property. She could not sue or be sued. She could not make contracts or defend herself in court. She was spoken for, literally. She did not exist in the eyes of the law, unless she disobeyed. That's when she became visible again. Not as a citizen, but as a threat. A wife's first duty was obedience, not affection, not partnership, obedience. And that obedience was not an expectation. It was enforced by custom, by scripture, by blood. The church echoed it from every pulpit. Wives, submit to your husbands. It was said to be God's will. Her husband ruled as Christ ruled the church. Her silence was holiness. Her resistance was sin. To refuse her husband was to refuse divine order. If he hit her, she was expected to reflect. If he forced himself on her, she was expected to forgive. If she fled, she was expected to return. Because the body of the wife belonged to the husband in every sense. Legally, sexually, spiritually. There was no such thing as rape within marriage, because in the eyes of the law, consent had already been given, once, for life. The courts upheld it. A woman taken by force on her wedding night had no case. She had, after all, become his property. Even nobles were not spared. Catherine of Valois, Queen of England, required permission from her son's council to remarry after widowhood, not because she was incapable, but because her status as wife, mother, widow, belonged to the state more than to herself. In villages, a woman could be publicly punished for disobeying her husband. That could mean refusing a chore, speaking out of turn, or simply being seen walking alone. Because obedience was not about action. It was about posture, deference, stillness, vanishing. A good wife knew her place, beneath. And if she forgot, the law was there to remind her. It didn't matter if you smiled. It didn't matter if you prayed. It didn't even matter if you were kind. If you were a wife, there was only one question. Could you produce an heir? That was your purpose. Marriage was not about love. It was about lineage. And a wife who could not deliver sons was a failed investment. In noble houses, your value could be measured in crib cries. Each pregnancy was a trial. Each month without one, a silent accusation. If you miscarried, it was your fault. If you bore daughters, it was your fault. If the baby died, you had cursed the line. No one questioned the husband's body, only yours. Your womb was a vessel, and when it didn't perform, the whole household turned cold. They whispered, they stared, they prayed louder around you. Some sent for midwives, some for apothecaries, some for priests. You were bleeding, you were purged, you were made to sleep with herbs between your thighs. And when that didn't work, they simply tried harder. More fasting, more pilgrimage, more pressure. Even when you were already with a child, the fear didn't stop. The danger only grew. There were no doctors, no anaesthesia, just wood-planked floors, boiled cloth, and women who had done this too many times. You screamed, and they told you to be quiet, for the baby's sake. If the child was stillborn, they covered it before you could see. If the child was a girl, they barely looked. If it was a boy, the servant shouted it through the halls. A good wife gave her husband sons. A perfect wife gave him many. But perfection came at a cost. Some women died delivering their sixth, some during the first. And still the system praised them. God called her early. She died fulfilling her duty. There was no mention of rest, no allowance for healing, no question of what she wanted. A queen could be married for 20 years and still be discarded for barrenness. The body that gave her status could just as easily take it away. In peasant homes it was the same. Your husband didn't want love. He wanted labour, sons to work the fields, daughters to raise the next sons. Your body was a field and he sowed it like one, every season, every night. You never stopped bleeding. You never stopped waiting. And when your belly stopped growing, so did their patience. That's when they said, "She's no longer useful. She's gone dry. She's done." But you were never asked if you wanted children, only whether you could give them. Because to be a wife was not to be a woman. It was to be a womb, with a name, and a grave already waiting. It starts with a raised voice, then a slammed door, then a slap. And no one says a word. Because in a medieval marriage, a wife who defied her husband wasn't just a problem. She was a threat to the household, to the village, to the order of God. So she had to be broken, and they had tools for that. The scold's bridle was one of them, a metal cage locked around the head, with a spike pressed against the tongue. If she spoke, she bled. If she screamed, she tore her own mouth open. It was paraded through the streets. A warning. They called it justice. They called it discipline. They called it love. The ducking stool was gentler, if drowning could be called that. A chair strapped to long wooden beams, used to dip women in rivers while the town watched. Once for gossip, twice for disobedience, 3 times, and they stopped pulling her up so quickly. And then there were beatings, some done behind closed doors, others done with witnesses, neighbours, clergy, even children, gathered to watch a wife be corrected. The law allowed it. The church blessed it. As long as the rod was no thicker than a man's thumb, it was not considered excessive. They called it the rule of thumb, and yes, they meant it literally. In the courts, a husband who struck his wife had to prove only one thing, that she provoked it, that she was loud, or lazy, or willful, that she embarrassed him, that she refused the bed, and if he succeeded in proving it, the judges praised his restraint. Because a woman who disobeyed risked more than bruises. She risked starvation, exile, public shame. A man could lock his wife away, refuse her food, or send her back to her father's home in disgrace. And no one would stop him, because she wasn't a victim. She was a failure. In towns, songs were written about nagging wives, stories told of women who tried to speak up and were punished by fate, struck by lightning, trampled by horses, devoured by wolves. The message was simple. A quiet wife lives. A loud one is forgotten. Even queens weren't immune. Anne of Bohemia was once called a serpent in royal letters for questioning her husband's decisions. Isabella of Angoulême was locked in a tower for interfering with politics. Catherine Howard was beheaded not for adultery, but for having a voice the court could no longer control. Because obedience wasn't just expected, it was enforced, and punishment didn't need proof, only accusation. You could be guilty just for walking alone, just for reading a book, just for saying no. And the people around you, they wouldn't protest. They'd nod. They'd say, "That's marriage." Because a medieval wife was never safe. Not in her home, not in the street, not even in her own skin. She belonged to her husband, and if she forgot that, they made sure she remembered. There was no escape. Not through the door, not through the law, not even through prayer. Because once a medieval woman was married, she stayed married. For life. There was no such thing as divorce. Not for her, not if her husband beat her, not if he vanished, not even if he took another wife in secret. The church said marriage was sacred, indivisible, permanent. What God has joined, no man can tear apart, and certainly not a woman. The only way out was death, or annulment. But annulment was rare, reserved for royalty, and even then, only granted if the union was never valid to begin with. You had to prove you were never truly married. Not that your husband broke you, not that he hurt you, not that you were miserable, just that the paperwork had a flaw. Maybe he was a cousin. Maybe the vows were forced. Maybe there was no consummation, and even then, you'd need his permission. Because a woman could not end a marriage alone. She could separate. But that didn't mean freedom. It meant shame. She'd be sent away with nothing, no land, no income, no children. Because children belonged to the father. He could take them from her, give them to a new wife, send them off to live in another household. And she? She could not remarry. She could not work. She could not live in peace. Because the world had no place for a wife without a husband. Some women fled anyway. They dressed as men, hid in convents, slept in barns, begged at roadside inns. They used false names and carried forged papers. But they were always hunted. The law called them fugitives, warranted, branded, returned. Returned to the man they had once been given to like livestock. Returned to the home they had bled in. Returned to the bed they had prayed to escape. Even queens found themselves trapped. Catherine of Aragon begged the Pope for annulment when Henry VIII demanded a new wife. She had served him for 24 years. She had birthed stillborns and one surviving daughter. She had endured exile, but she was told no. She died while still married, still obedient, still broken. Because in the eyes of the church she had done everything right, and in the eyes of the world she had done everything wrong. Medieval marriage was not a covenant. It was a cage. The key didn't exist. Or if it did, he kept it in his pocket. They told her she was free. They said, "You're a widow now. You can live." But freedom in widowhood was a lie. Because even after the husband was buried, the marriage did not end. Not really. The vows clung to her skin like ash. His name stayed stitched into her letters. His debts became hers. His lands, if she had any claim, were locked behind male guardians, and her body, though no longer claimed at night, was still not her own. She wore black, not for a week, not for a season, sometimes for years. In noble houses, mourning had rules. A queen wore a veil so thick she could barely breathe. Her sleeves had to be plain, no embroidery, no colour, no jewellery. Laughter was forbidden, singing unthinkable, dancing, blasphemy. A smiling widow was a dangerous thing, because people began to whisper, did she love him at all? In some households she wasn't even allowed to live alone. The husband's brother or cousin moved in for her protection. He oversaw her meals, her servants, her letters. If she tried to remarry, he could block it. Widows were seen as unstable, too emotional to make decisions, too tempting to trust. Because a woman without a man was suspicious, she had no reason to stay silent, and silence was the only virtue she was ever taught. In certain families, widows were forced into convents, not because they were holy, because they were inconvenient. A young widow, especially one without children, was considered a risk to family honour. She might fall in love. She might embarrass her father. She might demand land she had once been promised. Better to shut her away with prayers and cold stones. Let her scrub floors in silence. Let her light candles for a husband who never saw her. Peasant widows fared no better. If she had no sons, she had no claim to her cottage. She could be thrown out by her in-laws. She might remarry, but not who she chose, only who the village approved, only who could feed her, and even then her new husband might refuse her children, might sell them into servitude, might take her land and disappear. Because a widow's rights were paper thin. If she protested, the town elders would shake their heads. She was warned, they'd say. She should have stayed quiet. She was lucky to be chosen at all. They didn't say her name. They said this: even in death, a man's shadow was heavier than her entire life. She signed his surname until she died. She prayed for his soul. She donated coins in his memory, though he'd left her nothing. Because a wife did not stop being a wife just because the grave swallowed the man. She just became quieter, smaller, harder to find. And the world called that peace.